In 1841, the British philosopher Thomas Carlyle stated that, and I quote, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." What Carlyle was referring to was the British individuals who had helped expand and protect the British Empire. But it failed to take into account those who worked towards the betterment of those people who lived in the empire. Even the history of 19th century Ireland has largely been dominated by prominent political and military figures such as Daniel O'Connell, Charles Stewart Parnell, and James Stephens. Our major events, such as the Great Famine of 1845 to 52 and the Land War of 1879 to 82. But it has failed to highlight the contribution of philanthropists and charities who helped to improve the lives of people through their benevolence and charity. One such individual, who up to recently was only a footnote in Irish historiography, was the English Quaker James Hack Tuke, despite the fact that he was described in 1883 as Ireland's greatest benefactor. Tuke's failure to secure recognition and the limelight is not surprising, because he largely pursued his activities outside of the limelight and he shunned publicity. Nevertheless, his endeavors can be divided into three main categories. Firstly, his involvement in charity work and relief during the Great Famine of when he was in Ireland between 1846 and 1847. Again, during the famine of 1880. Also during the crisis in the west of Ireland of 1885 to 86, and again in Donegal in 1889. The second area of his contribution to the poor in Ireland was his assisted emigration scheme between 1882 and 1884. And the aim was to improve the lives of those who were sent to North America, but also those who remained in Mayo and Connemara. And finally, his charitable work can be seen through his engagement and his contribution to the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891. Tuke's Quaker background in York indicated the family's charitable activities, from the establishment of education facilities to the introduction of the first lunatic asylum in Britain. And James's brother Daniel became one of the leading psychiatric physicians in the country. At the age of 26, James came to Ireland with his friend William E. Foster as part of the Quaker relief response to the Great Hunger. And he visited Donegal and Connacht to provide first-hand accounts of the levels of poverty, death, and starvation that he witnessed. The result was him producing a pamphlet, A Visit to Connacht in 1847, in which he attacked the government and local landlords for their failure to provide assistance and to intervene for the starving Irish. Much of his time was spent in Erris, where he highlighted the extreme poverty and deprivation that he encountered. Tuke was to adopt this approach of writing and highlighting what he witnessed on his tours of Ireland in the subsequent famines that he reported on. Writing the pamphlet, A Visit to Donegal and Connacht during the spring of 1880, and report on the distribution of seed potatoes in Achill and the west of Ireland in 1886, with suggestions for permanent relief. What was important about these pamphlets was that they were uncensored and they were not edited. And in each case, he was reporting from those areas which he had visited during the Great Famine. And he concluded over the 50 years that no major improvement had occurred in relation to the improvement of the people. What he witnessed and wrote often brought him into conflict with local authorities and also national groups. In the 1847 pamphlet, he condemned the actions of Sir Roger O'Donnell, the largest landowner on Achill Island, and who was cooperating with the Quakers in the development of the linen industry in the Newport area. But large numbers of tenants had been evicted from the estate at Keele. But the land had been leased to the Achill Church Mission Society, who had carried out the evictions. But O'Donnell was condemned for not helping the dispossessed tenants who were unable to travel to the nearest workhouse at Westport, which happened to be 40 miles away. Tuke also highlighted the inhumanity of John Walsh, who evicted tenants from his property in the Mullet without providing any relief or sanctuary. These statements from a person so young were nevertheless highlighted in the House of Commons by people like Sir George Grey and other parliamentarians during a debate on the Irish famine in 1848. This approach was also pursued in his subsequent tours to areas affected by famine, providing first-hand accounts of what he witnessed, often accompanied by local clergymen or poor law officials who provided him with background information. His description of the landscape that he witnessed and the problems that the people had in surviving left his audience in no doubt how difficult their lives were. An example of this is from Camas in Connemara in 1880, in which he wrote, "I wish I could produce that rocky coast with miserable village, so that English people might realize how in these remote places so many thousands of people are living. I would venture to say no one would think it possible that any human being could live or even find a foothold on this rock-strewn shore. Several families were sitting around small quantities of the smallest old potatoes I've ever seen, and with nothing else to eat but them." Again in 1885, when he distributed relief in Mayo and Galway after the failure of the potato crop, he provides a graphic account of conditions under which the people lived, reporting from Lettermullen, I quote, "The poverty is unspeakable, and what misery and suffering are borne, which can never be revealed until some stranger comes poking into those out of the way areas." From his first visit to Ireland, Tuke showed an empathy and compassion for the poor of the west of Ireland. During his tour in 1847, he dismissed the official government argument that the Irish were lazy and famine was the result of their refusal to work hard and utilize the resources they had been given. He was just after returning from a tour of the United States, and he stated that he had witnessed Irish immigrants who worked hard and under the right conditions were able to live comfortably. He also highlighted the strong community bonds that existed amongst the Irish, who were prepared to send remittances back to their friends and relations in Ireland. And he also wrote that he witnessed families in Iris who had virtually nothing, prepared to share the little they had with neighbors who had nothing to eat. What he was doing was he was dispelling the myth in official government circles that the Irish were selfish and not prepared to help each other. Throughout his life, Tuke was prepared to counteract the preconceived English attitudes about the Irish. When he was asked at a parliamentary select committee meeting in 1882 why he was engaged with Irish paupers through his assisted immigration scheme in Connemara, he replied that they were not people, they were paupers, but the poor who existed in very poor circumstances. These sentiments are evident throughout his correspondence to his daughters, in which he refused to talk about the Irish in derogatory terms. While Tuke was critical of the government's response and involvement in the Great Famine and the Forgotten Famine, he realized by early 1880 there would never be any material improvement in the lives of the people of the west of Ireland without direct government intervention. Using his political and business contacts, he was able to secure government funding for his assisted emigration scheme in 1883 and 1884, but which was also extended to other poor law unions along the western seaboard, which were not administered by the Tuke Committee. He was prepared to advise and work with all Irish chief secretaries in the 1880s and 1890s, from W.E. Foster up to Arthur Balfour, to advance the condition of the people of the West. It was the Chief Secretary, John Morley, who asked Tuke to distribute relief in Mayo and Connemara in 1885. And again in 1889, he went to Donegal at the behest of the then Chief Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to report on conditions in the county after the potato had failed and what remedial measures needed to be put in place. By this stage, Tuke was also convinced that the region needed an economic stimulus to counteract the perennial subsistence and famine crisis, and thus, and this could only be achieved through direct government intervention. He was already in direct contact with Arthur Balfour as to how this could be achieved, paying a number of visits to the Chief Secretary's residence in the Phoenix Park. His correspondence indicates a certain frustration as to progress of these talks and the failure to put in place sustainable economic solutions. When the Congested District Board was established in 1891, Tuke was not entirely happy with its provisions, but nevertheless, the board saw the board as a building block in the advancement of the Western region. While Arthur Balfour had been given the credit for the formation of the Congested Districts Board, there is little doubt but that Tuke was the inspiration and the guiding force in its formation. The economic advancement of the West under the board would not have taken place, but for the persistence that with government politicians, and his role can be noted in that he was the only non-Irish commissioner appointed to the board when it was established. Even before the Congested Districts Board came into being, Tuke showed a pragmatism about the conditions of the West that was lacking in many other agencies and in government officials. This can be seen through his assisted emigration scheme between 1882 and 1884, which resulted in 1,300 families, a total of 9,500 people from Mayo and Galway, having their passage paid to a new life in North America. The proposals in 1882 were not radical because such schemes were already in place from the early 19th century, starting with the Peter Robinson scheme from the Blackwater region of North Munster to Peterborough, Ontario between 1823 and 1825. And of course, you had the notorious and controversial landlord schemes during the Great Hunger. Even during the forgotten famine of 1879 to 82, assisted immigration schemes were taking place, such as that of the Nugent scheme from Connemara to Graceville, Minnesota in 1880. When the Tuke scheme differed was that they were very well planned and coordinated. And unlike other schemes, they were not a knee-jerk reaction to the impending failure of the potato. After touring the west of Ireland in the spring of 1880 and realizing the people continued in abject poverty, Tuke visited the United States and Canada, holding meetings with individuals such as the Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, President Hayes of the United States, and Bishop John Ireland of St. Paul, Minnesota, to ascertain where immigrants should be sent, to where there were employment opportunities, and where their support was available. The Tuke immigration scheme differed from the other schemes in that the immigrants were sent to 218 different locations in North America, thus ensuring there was very little local opposition to the new arrivals. The main locations for the immigrants were in Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Ontario. Tuke had a preference to send the immigrants to Canada, where the government was prepared to provide assistance from their arrival in Quebec, and those sent to the United States. But they had to provide evidence that friends and relations would look after them upon their arrival. He also ensured that he had the support of local groups, both within Ireland and North America, which would ensure the success of the scheme. Prior to the establishment of the Tuke Committee in 1882, Tuke held meetings with Fair Foster, Father Nugent, and John Sweetman, all who were involved in assisted emigration schemes at this time. This helped him to work out the logistics and practicalities for the proposed schemes and to avoid any pitfalls. In Mayo and Connemara, Tuke was assisted by local clergymen, members, local officials from the poor law unions, and medical doctors, selecting the most suitable applicants to be sent. Only families rather than individuals were to be assisted. And each family had to have an adequate number of breadwinners who would support the rest of the family. One of the reasons for sending out families was Tuke envisaged that the holdings that were being vacated would then be redistributed amongst the remaining families, creating viable farms. In North America, Tuke worked with clergymen in the dispersal of the immigrants, who ensured that only 2 families were sent to each location on each boat. In Richmond, Indiana, the Gaughan and Ducey families from Balmullet were sent to the local pastor, Reverend McMullen, who looked after them. One of the families from Connemara, who arrived in Peterborough, Ontario, where the local priest agreed to take them in, had a house built for them by the local community and also employment. Many of these who had been involved in the scheme in Peterborough were descendants of the Robertson scheme that had been sent there between 1823 and 1825. Of those sent to Canada in 1883, 650 were sent directly to the care of Catholic clergymen, while another 1,200 were catered for by agents of the Dominion and the Ontario government. Even those sent to Minnesota, the vast majority of them were looked after by local priests at the behest of Bishop John Ireland. The success of the scheme in 1882, what happened was you had a very large demand the following year when the scheme came into being, as can be seen by between the 300 and 400 people who appeared for interview when Tuke arrived in Carna on the 27th of February, 1883. Tuke always felt that immigration had a role to play in overcoming the problems of overcoming poverty in the west of Ireland. He realized that remittances would play a major role in the survival of those who remained in Connemara and Mayo. And he was prepared, and he was sort of quite correct in this assessment. In 1884, it was estimated that between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds had been sent back by those immigrants who had left the Clifton area in 1882, in sums that ranged from £4 to £30. One of these immigrants who worked in a paper mill in Portland in Maine sent £3 home in July 1883. Others that had settled in places like Manchester, New Hampshire, Lynn, and Boston were also sending money back. Those who were assisted in 1882 and 1883 largely become agents for immigration, telling their friends and relations back home how well they were doing, urging them to join them in North America. As one immigrant from Cushariga, who had settled in Portland, Maine, told his relatives in Connemara, quote, "I ain't sorry for leaving Ireland, and if I got Feenish Island free forever, I would not go. There ain't a month, but we would have £20 a month." When all of the other immigrants who were based in the Midwest told his friend, a friend in Connemara, how well he would do if he came to what he called the land of freedom, and where you put your hand in your pocket to discover dollars. While the immigration scheme came to an end in 1884, largely due to the opposition of the Catholic Church, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Poor Law Guardians, an improved harvest, and the withdrawal of support by the British government. Tuke still saw it for the rest of the 1880s as an integral part of the panacea to the problems of the West. While government financial support was no longer available, still in the second half of the 1880s, Tuke was responsible for personally funding another 500 people from Mayo and Connemara to emigrate to North America. At the same time, many of the immigrants who had been sent out under the schemes were now sending money back so that friends and relations could join them. While the formal immigration scheme came to an end in 1884, Tuke was to use his experiences in the west of Ireland to highlight the ongoing struggle for survival by many individuals. It was during his tour of Connemara and Mayo in 1885 to 1886 that he introduces a process that becomes a bedrock of the Congested Board in the 1890s. This where he had previously highlighted the problems of communities. In 1885, 1886, he started highlighting the difficulties which individuals had, such as John Malley of Mulranny, who paid a rent of £2 4 a year, largely through seasonal migration, but had not been able to pay his rent for the previous 2 years. In 1885, Malley had left for England, but had only brought back £1 from his activities as a seasonal migrant. Later on, under the Congested Districts Board, what they did was, the officials, was they showed the income and expenditure that individual families had, as in the case of one family in Lettermullen, whose total income was £33, but their total expenditure was over £30. So you can see there was very little room for maneuver there. Tuke's experiences in Ireland were to change his political affiliations. The Tuke family were largely involved with the Liberal Party. Most of the nonconformists in Britain, they tended to support the Liberals in the 19th century. There was also the fact that one of his best friends was W.E. Foster, a parliamentarian who also became Irish Chief Secretary in 1880. Foster was responsible for Tuke coming to Ireland in February 1880 to report on famine in the west of Ireland. Indeed, Tuke was so well thought of in Liberal circles that he was asked in 1885 to contest the general election for the Liberal Party in the very same Liberal seat of York. In 1886, he turned down the offer of a peerage and a seat in the House of Lords from Earl Spencer. By this stage, his political allegiance had changed, and he was very critical of many of the Irish chief secretaries, including George Trevelyan, who had replaced Frederick Cavendish when he was murdered in the Phoenix Park by the Invincibles in May of 1882. Trevelyan refused to provide relief for the Karna area in 1882 when the potato failed. What does Tuke do? Tuke gives 130 pounds himself so that food could be brought in to feed the most destitute families in Karna. His criticism of the various chief secretaries was largely due to their failure to provide assistance for the poor of the west of Ireland. As with John Morley, because with the crisis of 1885, 1886, the Irish Chief Secretary, John Morley, had asked Tuke to go to the west of Ireland and distribute sort of food, not the government itself. By this stage, there was a feeling in some circles that relief money that was poured into the west of Ireland by the government was largely wasted and it achieved very, very little. He was undoubtedly, Tuke was influenced by what he witnessed during his tour in Connacht in the spring of 1880, when the Land League agitation was taking place. He was very much opposed to the 1886 and 1893 Home Rule bills that William E. Gladstone brought in. He felt that having looked at the way in which the Poor Law Guardians, who were now dominated by the National League and Parnell, how they operated, that they did not look after the problems of the poor. He also, by 1886, described Parnell as a dictator. But it was largely due to what he saw during the Land League agitation in 1880 that convinced him that the Home Rule would not be a good thing for Ireland. In April of 1880, 1 million people were being fed and kept alive by the private relief organizations. But at the same time, a general election was taking place. And none of the Home Rule candidates put forward any idea in relation to the famine crisis that was taking place. Thus, a factor as to why he did not see Home Rule as a good thing. He also was aware that the whole issue of the land purchase schemes was not necessarily going to be the solution for poor tenants along the Western Seaboard. In 1886, the Ashburn Land Purchase Act was brought in, which provided money so that tenants could buy out their farms from their landlords. But Tuke himself stated that what you would get should be, and I quote, should we not merely be face to face with 300,000 impoverished owners of land instead of 300,000 impoverished tenants. He felt that the resources would not be able to sustain the population because the holdings were too small for them to be able to survive and the land was too barren. Perhaps Tuke's greatest contribution to the people of the west of Ireland, and for which he has received little recognition, was his involvement with the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891. From the time that he came to Ireland in 1880, he realized that economic development of the region was essential to counteract the perennial famines and subsistence crisis. Right. Immigration was an immediate issue that would help with the poorest of the poor. But for the long-term economic development of the West, what was actually required was that an economic development plan would have to be put in place. This would ensure that the subsistence crisis and famines would help to be ameliorated. One of the areas that he pushed in particular was the development of an adequate transport system into the poorest areas of the west of Ireland. In 1880, when he had been in Connemara, he had been told of a village in the mountains that there was no road leading to it. Nobody basically knew it existed except for the local parish priest. And the people in the village knew nothing of the outside world. He felt that with an adequate transport system, it would help in the development of tourism, help also with regards to the fishing industry and agriculture. It would also help as well the development of local industries. In fact, up to 1883, there had been a number of suggestions in relation to the establishment of rail links, but this they had never taken place, largely because of government inertia, the refusal to provide finance, and also a lack of capital from within the local communities. With the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891, in the long term, it was to transform the regions that were the poorest parts of the country. You saw the development of fishing, and this was Tuke's responsibility, was to look after and develop the fishing industry by providing funds for the purchase of boats and that of equipment. Also, the opening up of markets, for the fish. And what is absolutely amazing is the amount of time that Tuke spent in 1892 and 1893 visiting places like Baltimore in County Cork, the Aran Islands, Burtonport in Donegal, seeing how the fishing industry could be developed and could be progress in these particular areas. One of the contributions that he has made as well was that he realized that with the coming of the Congested Districts Board and the money that was being provided for economic development, it was going to bring the end of an old a system and a way of life. It was Tuke that was responsible for getting people like Rutledge Fair and Robert Welch to photograph the regions before it disappeared. What has to be remembered is that Tuke was engaged in these activities in the 1880s and 1890s when he was over 60 years of age and when he was not in great health. In 1848, he had contracted famine fever or typhus as a result of helping Irish famine immigrants in York. In York, the authorities had refused to provide the facilities for the influx of these immigrants, but the Tuke family had built a shed where they could be looked after. It was as a result of tending to these immigrants that Tuke contracted the typhus. While he recovered, it did have a debilitating effect on him for the rest of his life. At times, he spoke about a lack of energy, a lack of strength, and not being able to do things. But yet, when you look at the time and energy he put into his activities in the 1880s and 1890s, it just shows his commitment and dedication. When he arrived in Clifton in April of 1882, 6 weeks later, he had arranged for the selection, the sending off, the clothing, the coaches that would bring them into Galway, and the ports, the ships to arrive in Galway, so that they could be sent off to North America. At times, he indicated that it was a burden he found extremely onerous, but nevertheless, it does indicate his commitment, his passion to the poor of the West. While Tuke may not have been recognized nationally for his contribution to the poor of the West of Ireland, there is no doubt that in the communities that he worked at the time, what he was doing for the people was greatly appreciated. While William Gregory, the husband of Lady Gregory, described him as Ireland's greatest benefactor in 1883, it was local leadership who praised him for his endeavours later on, even those who had been in opposition to him, especially over the assisted emigration scheme. According to Reverend Thomas Flannery, the parish priest of Carna, hundreds of families would have died of starvation, but for the relief provided by Tuke. While Reverend Linsky of Clifton told Tuke in 1886 that his parishioners told him how grateful they were to the work of Tuke and would offer him a céad míle fáilte on his next visit to Clifton. There was a story as well that was told by when Tuke attended one of the agricultural fairs which were being promoted by the Congested Districts Board in the 1890s. And when John Foran heard that this was Mr. Tuke, as they used to call him, Chuke, he went over to him and he said, "We should have to take our hats off to you for all that you have done in this area over the last number of years." What we actually see with Tuke is somebody whose passion, whose commitment to the poor was never in doubt. But what we also realize is that Tuke was prepared to go to great lengths, both politically and health-wise, in order to help those who he regarded as equals and not as paupers. Okay, thank you.